Guys, have you heard of a place called Qatar? The answer is no, you haven't. It's not a real place. It's not a real country. It's a natural gas reserve with a stadium at its center. You've probably heard at least a little bit about the stadium. I wanted to talk just briefly about this in one of my very infrequent sort of divulgences into sports and sports adjacent topics. So, Qatar, and don't worry, we're not reading the whole article. It's a country, ostensibly, a very small one. Look at that little dot over there. Wow, like a lot of countries in the Middle East. It is, its economy is heavily dependent on natural gas, oil, or other fossil fuel reserves. It is unique in that, despite a total population of 2.6 million, only 313,000 of them are Qatari citizens. So that's like 10% of the people in the country are actual citizens of the country, and about 90% of them are expatriates. So, expatriate, of course, is a resident who is not a citizen. A lot of those people are slaves. Qatar is a very high GDP per capita, and that's because it's another one of those like magnate countries where you have a bunch of ultra wealthy people who then funnel in migrant labor to do a lot of the actual like maintaining your country stuff. That's a classic. Dubai is like sort of the world hotspot for this. But I wanted to go over just briefly, if I may, a bit of information surrounding the state of the migrancy in Qatar and what actually built the stadium that the World Cup is being hosted in. It's pronounced Qatar. It's pronounced Qatar? That's stupid. I'm calling it Qatar. I don't even care. So, for those of you who don't know, close this, close that. There was a story that dropped somewhat recently, in this one about a year ago, that's been circling since. 6,500 migrant workers have died in Qatar since World Cup awarded. I believe the World Cup was awarded in 2010 or 10 years ago, something like that. Or a great number of migrant workers from India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka have died in Qatar since it won the right to host the World Cup 10 years ago. And it continues as such. I wanted to talk a bit about I guess, the state of the migrancy there, in the only form that I know how, which is reading out loud an article in a dramatic voice. Stick with me for a second, okay? Our dreams never came true. These men helped build Qatar's World Cup. Now they are struggling to survive. Kemal was standing outside a shop with other migrant workers, having finished yet another grueling workday. And when he said, and he says, a few others were arrested this August. Without explanation, the 24-year-old says he was put into a vehicle and for the next week kept in a Qatari jail, the location and name of which he does not know. When they arrested me, I couldn't say anything, not a single word, as I was so scared, he told CNN Sport, speaking at home in southern Nepal, where he has been working on a farm since being deported 3 months ago. Kemal, CNN has changed the names of the Nepali workers to protect them from retaliation, is one of many migrant workers wanting to tell the world of their experiences in Qatar, a country that will this month host one of the sport's greatest, most lucrative spectacles, the World Cup, a tournament which usually unites the world as millions watch the spectacular goals and carefully choreographed celebrations. Blah de blah de blah. First World Cup to be held in the Middle East. Most of the build-up in this tournament has been on more sober matters, that of human rights, from the death of migrant workers to the conditions many have endured in Qatar to LGBTQ and women's rights. Would it surprise you to know that Qatar has a not stellar human rights record? Kamal says he has yet to be paid the 7,000 Qatari Riyal bonus, around 2,000 he says he is entitled to from his previous employers, nor 7,000 Riyal in insurance for injuring two fingers at work. Describes the condition in the cell he shared with 24 other Nepali migrant workers. He says he was provided with a blanket and a pillow, but the mattress on the floor he had to sleep on was riddled with bed bugs. Inside the jail, there were people from Sri Lanka, India, Pakistan, Sudan, Nepal, Africa, Philippines. There were around 14 to 15 units. In one jail, there were around 250 to 300 people, around 24 to 25 per room. When they take you to the jail, they don't give you a room right away. They keep you in a veranda. After a day or two, once a room is empty, they keep people from one country in one room. Using a smuggled phone, he spoke to friends, one of whom, he says, brought his belongings, including his passport, to the jail, though he says he was sent home after the Nepali embassy had sent a paper copy of his passport to the jail. CNN has reached out to the embassy, but is yet to receive a response. When they put me on the flight, I started thinking, why are they sending workers back all of a sudden? It's not 1, 2, or 10 people. They're sending 150, 200, 300 workers on one flight. Some workers who were just roaming outside wearing work clothes were sent back. They don't even allow you to collect your clothes. They just send you back in the clothes you're wearing. Kamal believes he was arrested because he had a second job, which is illegal under Qatar's 2004 labor law and allows authorities to cancel a worker's work permit. He says he worked an extra 2 to 4 hours a day to supplement his income as he was not making enough money working 6 8-hour days a week. Qatar has a 90-day grace period in which a worker can remain in the country illegally without another sponsor, but if they have not had their permit renewed or reactivated in that time, they risk being arrested or deported for being undocumented. He says he received paperwork upon his arrest, which Amnesty International says would likely have explained why he was being detained, but as it was in Arabic, he did not know what it said and no translator was provided. A Qatari government official told CNN in a statement, "Any claims that workers are being jailed or deported without explanation is untrue. Action is only taken in very specific cases, such as if an individual worker participates in violence." The official added that 97% of all eligible workers were covered by Qatari's wage protection system, established in 2018, which ensures wages are paid in full and on time. Further work was being done to strengthen the system, the official said. So, I want to talk about living in a society for a moment, okay? Uh, the history of labor movements and the history of labor exploitation has largely come down to the differentiation between different economic classes. Marx would love this. Okay, he loved this very much. You know, you have slave societies, you have feudal societies, which often also had slaves. After we moved out of the old feudal system in the United States, the South still fought to keep slavery as their primary mode of production for their plantations. And even after the abolition of slavery, there has still been a protracted effort to separate society into different economic classes, which allows them to be more easily divided across the labor strata. What we are seeing here in Qatar and in Saudi Arabia and the UAE and several other countries is a use of citizenship to mark a clear distinction along which like the labor lines are drawn. We do this in the United States as well. You see, guys, if ICE really wanted to deport a lot of illegal immigrants, why don't they just sweep our agricultural production along the southern border and in California? They would be able to find millions of undocumented immigrants. The reason why they don't do that is because without those workers, we would starve. We need those workers. In reality, we maintain their undocumented status politically. We maintain it because it means that they remain a source of incredibly cheap labor that can be legally exploited without many concerns because they're not citizens, and therefore they are denied many of the protections that citizens are given. This is just a more extreme form of that. In its worst, what we're seeing here is essentially modern-day slavery. What happens is work recruiters will travel to very poor areas of Southeast Asian and African countries because there are, hey, lots of poor people there, and they'll say, hey, we'll pay for the ticket, buddy. You come on over here to our wealthy, developed Qatari nation, and we'll give you good work. We'll pay you a lot, too. Now, what often happens, of course, is that these workers are lied to about basically every level of this system. Their wages, the work they'll be doing, the conditions they'll be subjected to. It's a fairly common practice to take away their passport if they once they arrive, meaning that they legally no longer have the ability to exit the country and return back to their home country because they are because they literally can't cross borders anymore. So what we're talking about here is like human trafficking followed by like work or you'll be arrested. And oftentimes they're unpaid or subjected to conditions which are fairly lethal in nature. I'm comfortable calling this slavery of a modern kind. I mean, we're talking about people being forced to work, often for incredibly low or no compensation, following human trafficking. I mean, it's whatever terminology you want to use here, it's not good. Qatar's 10% citizen population, as opposed to like the rest of the migrancy they encourage and bring into the country. This is kind of like it's a way of using statehood and citizenship to draw lines that previously would have been defined by aristocracy versus feudal serfs. That's what they're doing. You realize that, right? Because the goal before was like serfs didn't own anything; they worked the land of their lords. The lords could do whatever they wanted, really. And what we're doing here is using like the trappings of modern statehood to bring about the same basic conditions. Oftentimes, the exploitation of labor as a class is about finding ways to suitably differentiate those groups. It was easy to do back in the in the feudal days because there was often like a civic or sometimes religious justification to the supremacy of the nobles and certainly of the monarchy. Under slavery, scientific racism was developed and iterated upon as a way of logically justifying slavery as a social system, explaining why it was actually fair and good. And what this is an exploitation of, I'm going to say it, neoliberal economic practice as a way of bringing about pre-modern labor differentiation. Because what this is here is right to work, isn't it? Take a look at this from in The Economist. The world also looks at migrant workers in Qatar through a distorted lens. For one thing, the emigrant is more open to foreign labor than America or any other European country. Native Qataris make up only 12% of the population, a proportion supposedly more enlightened countries simply would not tolerate. Although these migrants are sometimes mistreated, the wages, etc., etc. I care not to read the article. Qatar is actually very open to foreign labor. Oh, look at how willing they are to open their country up to other people. Oh, they're able to make more money here than they ever could back in their home countries, Who was the person who wrote that article back in, I think, 2013, following a big, like, workplace accident somewhere outside the modern West, where they wrote, like, yes, it's okay for different countries to have different, like, labor safety standards, because the free will of the market determines that there's a higher monetary demand for better labor conditions in the West, so blah blah blah. Why poor foreign people should live more dangerous lives at the for the benefit of the wealthy corporations that exploit them. Yeah, I think it was the explosion in India, something like that. Here we go. Oh, this isn't even the one that I was thinking of, but yeah, in defense of sweatshops, they're often the best and fastest way for the poor to escape poverty. A classic thing people do because of sweatshops, escape poverty. It's a thing they love to do there. When was this from? 2014. This would have been around the time. There is a there is like a wing of like liberal libertarian sentiment that is all about like, yeah, actually these horrific labor conditions and around the world, these are actually like the forces of modernity. Oh, Matt Iglesias. Yeah, I think Matt was the one who wrote that, the one that I'm thinking of specifically. Yes, different places have different safety rules, and that's okay. Matthew Iglesias. What's up, my man? It's very plausible that one reason American workplaces have gotten safer over the decades is that we now tend to outsource a lot of factory explosion risk to places like Bangladesh, where 87 people just died in a building collapse. This kind of consideration leads Eric Loomis to the conclusion we need a unified global standard for safety, by which he does not mean that Bangladeshi levels of workplace safety should be implemented in the United States. I think that's wrong. Bangladesh may or may not need tougher workplace safety rules, but it's entirely appropriate for Bangladesh to have different and indeed lower workplace safety standards than the United States. Literally, like, oh no, wow, you cuck, you bleeding heart liberal. You don't want people to die in factory explosions that are caused by the negligence and cost saving measures of the bourgeoisie. Wow, well, don't you realize the free hand of the market has a higher, places a higher premium on workplace safety in the West? Don't you know that Westerners' lives are literally worth more monetarily? Um, yeah, this what what Qatar is doing is nothing more than the logical extension of liberal or neoliberal economic policy as a way of reinventing slavery. It is the same logic as those who say that like having prisoners work from prison for like slavery wages is acceptable because at least it gives them something, you know, because otherwise they'd be making no wages. It's the logic that sweatshops are acceptable because they're better than subsistence farming. It's the idea that anything can be justified as long as it adheres to some free market logic, because the free market is necessarily a liberating force. Truly, genuinely disgusting. But that's what we're dealing with here. So I just want, a lot of people are framing what's happening with Qatar as some kind of like Islam thing. They're framing it as some kind of like, oh yes, this despotic monarchist, like oil magnate state piece of shit in the Middle East, you know. But it's not that. What we're seeing here, this is us. We did this. The World Cup was essentially bribed into holding the World Cup here in 2022, in spite of the massive human rights issues and the projected dangers and the higher cost in the weather and so on and so forth. The World Cup heavily influenced, at the very least, by Western interests. You know, we are the baddies here. We justify these systems. The Qatari state have also covered up a number of migrant workers. Yeah. The Qatari state is disgusting and regressive and monarchical and bad in almost every imaginable way. But I want to make it clear that the specific thing we're looking at right here, that is the mistreatment of migrant workers, this is a direct product. This is like the IMF and the World Bank are like double thumbs upping this. Not literally, of course. That'd be optically very bad. But this is an extension of the same economic principles. Obviously, what they do would be considered illegal in like US or many European countries. But that doesn't really matter. Right? Because, well, as Matthew Gasius put it, Gasius, uh, maybe you don't need the same labor protections in Qatar that you do in America. You know, maybe there are just going to be different labor protections, and maybe that's right. What is the way towards economic prosperities for countries like Bangladesh? That is very tangential. Um, oh yeah, I saw this. The World Cup president, when he faced criticism for the fact that he hosted this in like a despotic like slave state, basically, FIFA president Gianni Infantino has accused critics of Qatar's human rights record of staggering hypocrisy and racism in a bizarre and incendiary attack on the eve of the 2022 World Cup finals. In a 57-minute diatribe which frequently drew gasps of astonishment, Infantino claimed the Western nations were in no position to give morality lessons to Qatar based on their past and current behavior. We've been told many, many lessons from some Europeans from the Western world, he said. I think for what we Europeans have been doing to the last 300 years, we should be apologizing for the next 3,000 years before starting to give moral lessons to people. Interesting. It's always interesting how the greatest perpetrators of human misery are willing to deflect from criticism of their behavior by pointing out that actually, you know, look at me, a Westerner, directly sponsoring like human rights abuses through my collaboration with a monarchical state. But this is kind of like an extension of people framing this as an Islam thing, right? Like, this guy's wrong no matter what. However, um, a lot of people are genuinely thinking of this as like a Qatari thing specifically, but this guy's in on it. The World Cup is predominantly, like of Western interest, as is most everything international in the world. We facilitate this. Infantino also played down concerns over whether LGBTQ plus fans face danger in a country where gay people risk torture and imprisonment, and insisted that Qatar, with FIFA's help, had reformed workers' rights beyond all recognition. The speech began, though, with Infantino appearing to suggest that his own experiences as the son of Italian immigrants in Switzerland gave him a deep understanding of migrant workers and other minorities in Qatar. Today I feel Qatari, he said. Today I feel Arabic. Today I feel African. Today I feel gay. Today I feel disabled. Today I feel like a migrant worker. Me too. I know what it means to be discriminated against. As a child, I was bullied because I had red hair and freckles. Plus, I was Italian, so imagine. I love this. This is quintessentially Italian. Later, it was pointed out that in his opening monologue, he had missed out on half the world's population. I feel like a woman too, Infantino added. There we go. Could transitioning have saved her? Look at what he's saying here. Qatar is offering the migrant workers this opportunity, he said. They do it in a legal way. We in Europe, we close our borders. We don't allow practically any workers from these countries who are trying to come work legally in our countries. It's always whataboutism. If you really care about the destiny of these migrant workers, these young people, Europe can do as Qatar did. Create some channels, some legal channels to increase the percentage of those workers to come to Europe. Give them some work. Give them some future. Remarkable. Are Italians black? Yes. I have nothing more to say of this. I just want people to understand that while there are things Qatar is doing that are specific to its like Islamic culture, that is like the homophobia and such, like let us not delude ourselves. You know, Islamic countries have a tendency to have pretty bad civil rights records on those issues. The migrant worker issue, the human rights issue broadly, is just a facilitation of very basic, like modern economic logic that's employed all around the world. And the people who push austerity in the West are the same people who don't really see an issue with stuff like that outside of the West. Qatar also banned alcohol at the World Cup at the last moment. Yeah. 11th hour U-turn. Phenomenal stuff. FIFA confirms move as official beer brand says, "This is awkward." Very nice. All right. I wanted to talk real quick about the Qatari World Cup homophobia stuff. Real quick, I mean. Here's a big tweet. How big? 321,000 likes. That big. As a Qatari, I'm proud. Oh, sorry. The tweet that he's responding to here is a security guard saying to change out of a shirt that has a rainbow in it because gay people bad, etc. This person says, as a Qatari, I'm proud of what happened. I don't know when will the Westerners realize that their values aren't universal. There are other cultures with different values that should be equally respected. Let's not forget the West is not the spokesperson for humanity. So this is what I'm kind of calling like woke homophobia, or like using anti-colonialism as a shield for homophobia. The essential argument here is like their country, their rules, right? Like, well, is that an argument we would apply everywhere? Like, is that something that people tend to do? They're like, oh, this other country does something I don't like. I will not criticize it because it's their responsibility. No. If you go into the comments under that tweet, you'll find it's mostly Westerners, specifically Western conservatives, who are celebrating this as a triumph of traditionalism. You might remember that the far right, Putin to the West, has been obsessed with the idea that the progressives in America are exporting our liberal degeneracy. Do you remember that statement from Jordan Peterson where he said that he believed that Russia was right to invade Ukraine if it meant defending itself against trans ideology? The idea that Western liberalism is a plague that infects countries is a long-standing one with conservative groups. It has been around for literal centuries. And what they're essentially doing here is selectively adopting cultural relativism as a way of justifying a position they already hold. Or to put it another way, these conservatives are not actually cultural relativists. They're just homophobic. Cultural relativism is the idea that an action, or whatever, becomes moral based on the circumstances in which it takes place. So an example of a classic moral relativist position would be that, like, it wasn't morally wrong for George Washington to own slaves, because that's what everyone did back then, especially if you were wealthy, you know? Now it's wrong, but to them, it wasn't morally wrong. This is a very discredited, like, philosophical position. Like, nobody serious actually believes this. The idea that whether or not something is good depends on whether people at the time think it's good is not really a defensible position, and anybody who actually believed that would really, really, really quickly, like, not believe that if given the right circumstances. Oh, hey, this one country has decided that ethically it really doesn't mind the sexual abuse of children, so a bunch of people are now expats in that country, and they're just going over there. And then, what, would you expect somebody to then go, oh, well, if they think that's okay, then I'm okay with it? Nobody would really say that, of course, except for pedophiles, I guess, because usually moral relativists are actually just in support of the thing they're saying is culturally acceptable in another country, right? Like conservatives in the West who are accepting of Qatar being culturally homophobic aren't doing so because they respect Qatar. Conservatives constantly talk shit about other countries all the time. Uh, they just like the homophobia, you know? Talk with them about female genital mutilation. Talk about African countries where little girls have their clitorises cut off, you know? Well, they consider it moral there, you know? You'll very quickly find out that they're not actually that culturally, respectful when it comes to moral relativism, you know? Often the counter argument with conservatives is like, so you believe some cultures are better than others? To which the obvious answer is yes. No shit. Everyone thinks this. Um, Different cultures have different attitudes to different serious positions. Yep, obviously. Um, yeah, like everyone thinks this. Glad that's over. Yeah. Anyway, conservatism, because conservatives are cowards, has always been about finding the long way of justifying hatred towards minority groups, you know? Um, like a good example would be the AIDS crisis, where Reagan prevented the Center for Disease Control from investigating AIDS and finding solutions, cures, or treatments to it because the Reagan administration wanted gay people dead. It was a common conservative position at the time that AIDS was a divine punishment for the hedonism of homosexuals, and the Reagan administration fully just abetted a genocide, which I completely consider it to be because it was deliberate state action that allowed those deaths to happen. You know, it's not like they didn't spend enough money looking for a cure. Reagan told the CDC to not do their job there. That was a deliberate extra effort to keep the gay people from getting treatment. And but at the time, conservatives were like, "Oh well, it's God's punishment," you know. But that's a justifying mechanism, right? Obviously, they really just hate gay people, as they clearly do, you know, here. So I just wanted to front this because we're going to be seeing a lot of this as time goes on. Uh, the far right here in the West has spent more and more time and energy palling up to the far right in less developed or less socially developed countries. A good example of this would be Hungary. Hungary, of course, is ruled by a dictator, Orban, or pseudo-dictator. He's functionally a dictator. They have a weak democratic framework that isn't functionally capable of changing the outcomes at this point. He's a dictator. He is. But anyway, you know, CPAC was held recently in Hungary, where American conservatives and policymakers could talk with and learn from a guy who became a dictator in his country. When Hungary passed laws that restricted the media or queer people, Western conservatives celebrated. So we are now in an era where we're going to see more and more reactionary foreign governments used by Western conservatives as positive examples of diversity of human thought. And I bet you more and more conservatives are going to be morally relativist. You're going to hear more and more arguments about, oh, so they behead gay people? Oh, well, that's their culture. Oh, well, of course, they want to defend themselves against Western degeneracy. Oh, this, oh, that, you know. Great stuff.